What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
So a lot of you guys really seem to enjoy the whole idea of answering the question, how powerful is Legion? The Age of X story, they gave us a scenario where one of Legion's personalities basically went crazy and then turned, really just kind of altered reality. You know, took this little island of utopia that the X-Men had been residing on, warped the very fabric of existence to the point that this island was basically turned into kind of like a fortress, and then took everything else in the universe and put it inside of a box. It basically removed this island, this fortress, from all of existence. And it was crazy because it's this mind-boggling display of power. And so what I thought we would do for the next, couple of weeks or so is we would basically follow up with Lost Legions. Now, what Lost Legions does is it immediately comes out of Age of X, in the sense that once reality was restored to normal at the end of the video that we did last week, which you'll find down in the description, what we ended up finding out was that a few of Legion's personalities had basically taken off. Now, the way this worked was actually kind of interesting. Somewhere along the line, remember, Dr. Nemesis was the guy who was working alongside Charles Xavier to try to mend the mind, to try to delete these personalities of Legion. Somewhere along the line, after the events of Age of X, Dr. Nemesis had provided Legion with a neural switchboard. And what this meant was that Legion could basically tap into the powers of his personalities. And that was a really cool concept because this has never really happened before. Remember, when it comes to the character of Legion, he has thousands of personalities, like over 1,000 personalities in his mind, and each personality has a distinctive power. And so the character of Cindy, for example, who can control fire, will manifest. Cindy will take over the body of Legion. Cindy will be the active personality, and then she'll just begin using, pyrokinesis to do whatever it is that she wants to do. But Legion, David Haller himself, could not access her abilities on his own. What this neural switchboard does is it allows David Haller to access these powers while keeping his mind intact. And so essentially what this does is it makes him quite possibly the most powerful mutant in existence, well beyond the powers of Matthew Malloy. Now, that's kind of the difference here, and this is something that I wanted to talk about because a lot of people have asked this question. When it comes to individuals whose minds are whole, that is to say, they have no multiple personalities and it's just them and whatever power they happen to have, Matthew Malloy is right up there at the cream of the crop. The reason why Legion is so powerful is because he has thousands of powers, a multitude of different powers. And so that's what makes him so capable. Really, up until Lost Legions, Legion himself, David Haller, was just like this wildly powerful individual, but you never knew what his story was going to be about. You never knew what things were going to do. But the fact remains here that when Legion began using this neural switchboard and began accessing these various personalities and testing these powers out, what we found was that 6 personalities had basically come up missing. Now, these 6 personalities come in the form of Endgame, Susan and Sunshine, Chain, Time Sync, The Bleeding Image, and Sticks. Now, Susan and Sunshine was always my favorite personality. More than Jamil Kamari, more than like Jack Wayne, she was always one of my favorite characters because she's like a little girl basically. But what we find out here is that when the Age of X timeline, when that series of events had taken place, that all of Legion's personalities had physical bodies. The problem is that when David Haller had seized control of his mind again and he had set everything back to normal, these 6 personalities did not go back into the mind of Legion. Instead, they basically manifested out in the real world. And that's essentially what everybody's beginning to understand. Now, the way that we learn this, the way that it's verified, is by way of Rogue. Now, this is something that I want to touch on here for a second. Historically speaking, Rogue's character was always a mutant, that she would basically just absorb people's life essence, their memories, their powers by physical touch. And it was a passive ability, meaning she could not control it. And whenever she touched someone, if she held on long enough, she would basically kill them. The issue with this is that Marvel had been writing, Rogue for decades. And so the idea was to basically revamp her character, to change her up. Not only that, the X-Men mythos kind of needed to be changed up a bit. And so, of course, we saw the House of M storyline, which reduced the mutant population down to 198. This was a multi-staged effort. The next stage was to go through each of these individual mutants and start to change them, go through some of the X-Men and alter their past, alter their characters, what they were about, how they focused, different things like that. That's the reason why in this story, and we'll get to that here in a second, Cyclops is basically leading the X-Men, because after the events of House of M, Xavier was missing. And so it was left to Cyclops and Emma Frost to run the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. When Charles came back, he basically kind of had to acquiesce and let them continue running the show. And so he was more of an advisor than an actual leader of the X-Men at the time. But with the character of Rogue, what had happened is there was basically this bomb, more or less, this kind of, wildly powerful bomb that was, I guess, created or controlled by the Shi'ar, called the Hecatomb. And inside this Hecatomb were just just like memories, personalities, a multitude of things. Well, the bomb had basically been detonated and all these personalities had been absorbed by Rogue. The issue was that she had billions of personalities in her mind and it basically began to overwhelm her. Now, all this came to a head during the events of Messiah Complex, when the first mutant Hope Summers was born after the events of M-Day, of the House of M. And what had happened was Hope Summers, her hand had basically been touched to Rogue. Hope was not impacted by Rogue's deadly touch. And the result was that all the personalities in Rogue's mind were basically wiped clean. It was essentially a soft reboot for her character. And so going forward after that, the only personality in Rogue's mind was her own, as well as the personality of Mystique, who she'd basically lashed out at because Mystique was the one that put the hand of Hope Summers to, you know, to Rogue's face. But what ended up happening is Marvel had a story called X-Men Salvage, X-Men Legacy Salvage. And all that did was just kind of like see the return of Rogue to the X-Men roster, among other things. But during this time, Rogue had basically learned to control her power. So she can touch anybody. It doesn't mean she's going to absorb their personalities or powers or anything like that. She can touch anyone she wants to. She now has the freedom to control her abilities. And it was actually a great change for her character, because after a while, everybody got tired of hearing Rogue cry about how she couldn't touch another human being. You know, sorry about your luck, Rogue, get over it. So what ended up happening, or at least what we do here anyway, is we transition over to Cyclops. Now, of course, the idea here is that as far as everybody's aware, these personalities are hiding out in Europe as well as London. And so the idea is to basically take a team of Gambit who can track them down, Rogue who can act as this sort of telepath to a degree by helping to tap into the mind of Legion through physical touch, Charles Xavier who can be a tried and true telepath, as well as Legion himself. And the four of them intend to basically track down each of these personalities, capturing them, allowing Legion to basically absorb them into himself. Now, the caveat to this is that Magneto is basically brought on board by Cyclops, as well as a girl named Frenzy. Now, Frenzy's not wildly important for this particular video, but Frenzy's basically a girl that has indestructible skin. The only thing that can penetrate her skin is adamantium. In addition to this durability that she has is also extends to her internal organs. And that's like the difference between Frenzy and Luke Cage, right? I mean, if you were to take Luke Cage and you dropped him out of an airplane at 10,000 feet, he would die because of the fact that his organs would just hit against his skin. His brain would probably smash against his skull because his internal organs are not impenetrable. It's just his skin that's impenetrable. With Frenzy, it's not that way. She can withstand virtually anything. She's very Incredible Hulk-like in that capacity. She's not nearly on the same strength level as the Incredible Hulk, but in terms of her durability, she's, for all intents and purposes, completely indestructible. But what this does is this basically picks up in a small town with regards to the arrival of Gambit and Xavier, Magneto, all these different guys, and they're trying to track down Time Sync. This is when things get really, really cool. And the reason why is because when they get to this town, everybody's knocked out cold. Now, no one really knows why, and even Legion himself says he doesn't know why, and the reason for this is because of the fact that Time Sync has the ability to manipulate time. He doesn't really have anything to do with the human mind outside of how the human mind perceives time and people's ability to move back and forth through time. And so, of course, the cool thing about this is that because these are not physical beings, because they're not like actually people, they're basically personalities, it's like trying to catch smoke. So for Charles Xavier, he can't really read their mind per se because they're not really alive. They don't really have like synapses and different things like that. And so it's this crazy situation. But ultimately what ends up happening is between a combination of Gambit as well as Magneto eventually finding Frenzy, where she's basically frozen in time after she had first encountered Time Sync, Magneto's able to trace him down or able to track him down. And the cool thing is that Magneto tries to use like an EMP, like an electromagnetic pulse, to try to basically knock out Time Sync, or at least, disrupt what passes for a brain functions inside his head. The funny thing about this is that Time Sync says, when you guys first got here, all the people in this village were knocked out. The reason why is because when you used your powers to create this EMP, I opened a portal through time. I sent that power into the past and it knocked out everybody in the town. So it's really cool the way this unfolds. It's actually really, really interesting, but you guys see the danger with these kind of personalities, and Time Sync's not even the most dangerous one. Like, I would say Sticks is probably the most dangerous of all the personalities. Maybe Susan and Sunshine, because you don't really suspect her to be as dangerous as she is. But the cool thing about this is that eventually Gambit's able to track down Time Sync. And that's what's wild about this, is because when Gambit tries to grab him, Time Sync just starts manipulating time around him and forces Gambit to relive these crushing moments in his life. The experiences of his abusive father, being part of the mutant massacre, or at least leading the Marauders to the Morlock tunnels and then bailing out before the mutant massacre happened, but basically engineering the possibility for them to massacre all the Morlocks below New York. That's a really old story from way back in the day. It was really like the first major X-Men crossover in Marvel Comics, but the fact remains that Gambit's taken out quick, fast, and in a hurry. And so eventually Legion's able to track down his own personality. Now, that's kind of the funny thing here, is because what Timesync says is, we escaped. Like, your mind is a prison. We didn't want to be housed there anymore. And that's why this whole concept of Legion's personalities work, because they think for themselves. They have their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own wants, their own desires. They are, for all intents and purposes, distinctly different individuals. That's why the whole idea of Legion having multiple personalities was such a dangerous thing, is because when one of those personalities takes over the body of David Haller, then there's no telling what it is they might do. If they're a particularly evil personality, they'll do terribly evil things. If it's like David Haller himself, where he just kind of goes nuts and decides that he wants to kill Magneto in the past, he does that, Xavier jumps in the way, and the Age of Apocalypse starts. And so it creates these really, really cool situations in terms of what stories we might see. But ultimately, Legion kind of proves to be a little bit powerless towards his personality. And that's the other half of this, is that we would think that with these being the personalities of David Haller himself, all these different aspects, these different personalities of his, it'd be easy for him to control them, that he would just be able to grab them and pull them back in. It doesn't work that way, because they have powers, and some of them have powers that Legion himself cannot directly counter. And so with regards to the character of Timesync, his ability to manipulate the very fabric of time creates for a wildly dangerous situation, because he can basically freeze time around Legion, freeze all time in existence, walk towards Legion, unfreeze time, and then stab him in the back. And so it creates this really, really interesting situation, because it shows us what kind of scenario we would be seeing if mutants had these particular powers in the actual comics themselves. The closest we come to a lot of these, with the exception of telepaths, especially when it comes to something like this for time manipulation, would be like Thanos with the Time Stone. When we were going through the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, and he started sending people back to the age of dinosaurs on the planet Earth, just literally started dropping them through these different eras in the universe's history. But again, really all Legion was doing here was just buying time. And the reason why was because despite the fact that Timesync is not really like a person per se, Timesync is made up of a substance. He's made up of something. And so because of the fact that he's basically solid matter, even though he's still a personality, he's tangible. And if he's tangible, he can be touched. And if he can be touched, Rogue can steal his powers. And that's exactly what she does. She basically sneaks up on him from behind, grabs him, shuts his powers down after stealing them, and then eventually, Timesync is just a normal human being, just a normal person. And so what ends up happening here is Legion basically just kind of absorbs Timesync back into himself again, but he says things are only going to get more dangerous from here. Things are only going to get worse, because we've still got Susan and Sunshine that we have to face off against. We've still got Chain that we have to face off against, a person that's virtually untouchable. We have Sticks that we're ultimately going to have to face off against, probably one of the most dangerous of all his personalities. And so what we do is we transition to Sticks proper. And what we find out is that with Sticks being a telepath, his telepathy exists in a multitude of different ways. There's traditional telepathy where he can just read the mind of people around him, but Sticks also has the ability to grab the mind of a person and then use them as an anchor to what's going on. Now, the reason why Sticks does this instead of just like taking over the mind of one of the people there is because if Sticks did that, Charles Xavier would immediately pick it up and would immediately know what's going on. Instead, by going through a person, it's basically like a proxy. It's Sticks going through this woman, and then no one really knows what's going on. No one's aware that it's happening. Instead, he can simply just kind of operate like a fly on the wall, listening to this conversation that's going on, and in turn have an understanding of what the team of Charles Xavier and Magneto are intending to do with regards to capturing and rounding up these different personalities. With the group more or less taking off to London, which is where these personalities were last believed to be, the issue with this is that Professor X is kind of helping to guide them to a degree, but the problem is that as they make their way through this, they're immediately met by Chain. And the reason why is because they get into this town and everyone's gone. Like, everybody's basically vanished. Now, with the personality of Chain, he basically has self-duplication, but he's not like Jamie Madrox. He's not like, Multiple Man. Jamie Madrox just makes duplicates of himself, but you can destroy any of the duplicates and it doesn't matter. With Chain, it's a lot of the same way. The difference is that he duplicates by touching. So if he touches you, you become a duplicate of him. Now, if you kill the original Chain, well, then everybody else just go back to normal. It's kind of the writer's way out. It's Marvel's way out of this story without sacrificing an entire town of people in England. But the idea here is that all the personalities can think independently, but they also share a hive mind at the same time, if that makes any sense. For example, the 1A, Chain 1A is like the main personality, the main individual that all these others are branched off from. Chain 1A has his own ambitions, his own goals. He's working alongside Sticks in order to stay out of the mind of Legion to keep from being captured. All the other personalities follow his orders, but they can also think for themselves. So I guess maybe they could rebel if they wanted to, but they wouldn't really have a reason to. But the cool thing here is that, again, Chain himself, that's his only real ability. He doesn't have like energy projection or anything, but he has all kinds of weapons. And that's the problem, is when they get in here, they're facing an army of thousands of people, all of whom have weapons. And so it creates this wildly insane situation. Of course, for the most part, the X-Men are able to hold their own to a degree. I mean, Magneto, Rogue, these folks are able to hold their own, and they serve their purpose. Of course, the issue here is that eventually Legion jumps back into the fray, and Legion's able to absorb Chain back into himself quick, fast, and in a hurry. But in the middle of all this, what ends up happening is that the mission turns out to be a success, in the sense that this was all designed to be a distraction. This was all designed to be a ruse. The overarching goal of Chain was to serve the purpose of basically having everybody look over here so that he could have one of his personalities kidnap Charles Xavier and take him over to Sticks. Now, transitioning over to Gambit and Frenzy. Remember, Gambit just kind of being this suave guy that everybody loves. It's kind of a holdover from the 1990s. And Frenzy being a character that dates back quite some time and actually served as one of the agents of Apocalypse. The two of them don't really see eye to eye, and they never have. A lot of this is because of the fact that Frenzy just doesn't trust anyone. Like, Frenzy is very Magneto-esque in terms of her personality, in terms of the fact that she doesn't really like people. She views humanity, normal humans, baseline humans, as being evil in a lot of different ways. But in the midst of their conversation, suddenly both Frenzy and Gambit start kissing one another. Now, as soon as that happens, they're like, what in the heck is going on here? And that's when they start to realize it's mind control. And that's what Susan and Sunshine does. She doesn't really control minds, she amplifies emotions. And that's kind of what's being hinted at here, is that the baseline emotion between the two of these people, between Gambit and Frenzy, is some measure of attraction that's there. The issue is that they would never act on it because their ideals are two totally different things. They would never really see eye to eye. But Susan and Sunshine's able to grab that emotion and bring it out. Now, the caveat to this is that Susan and Sunshine's powers are directly tied to her emotional state. And that's the crushing thing, because they were like, we have to go. Like, when Legion was explaining who Susan and Sunshine was, they were like, we have to go to London and we have to like berate a little girl. Like, really? Like, we have to make a little girl cry? Like, how evil is that? And it's hilarious. It's funny to see it happen. But of course, Susan and Sunshine, again, just kind of meanders to herself and just kind of muses to herself about how happy she is. But ultimately, Frenzy just like rips the head off her dolly and makes Susan and Sunshine cry. And that's when her power begins to dissipate. That's when her power begins to go away. Now, of course, we only get a quick glimpse. Keep in mind, Susan and Sunshine is the personality of a little girl, and she thinks and feels like a little girl. And so really all she wants to do is go home. And so when Legion approaches, she's like, yeah, I can finally go back home, because these are one of the personalities that escaped, but didn't really follow Styx's lead, didn't really believe in what Styx was doing. She was just kind of out there in left field doing her own thing, manipulating people's emotions and kind of making them go crazy. But of course, she ends up merging back with Legion again. But the cool thing about this is that Legion's able to eventually track down Chain 1A. And of course, again, once Chain 1A is reabsorbed, the question is, if Charles Xavier's missing, then the only person that would have taken him would have been Styx. And if he's been taken to Styx, then that presents the most dangerous scenario. And this is when we start to learn a little bit about Styx's powers, what it is that he's capable of. The problem is that as they go through their journey and they eventually end up in Paris, which is where Styx is residing, and they end up having to go down into the catacombs, Rogue comes across Bleeding Image. Now, Bleeding Image is another one of these really, really cool personalities, because Bleeding Image is basically a living voodoo doll. If Bleeding Image comes across you and he basically, kind of imprints on you, he can begin stabbing himself in different locations or inflicting harm on himself, and you'll feel the pain instead of him. And it's cool in terms of how that happens, because it's a great counter to the character of Rogue. If Rogue can like touch somebody and absorb their powers, well then what do you do? Like, where do you go from there? Like, how do you get that to work? How do you square that circle? And so the funny thing about this is that what Bleeding Image does is essentially say, look, the powers of Rogue, because of the fact that Bleeding Image is one of Legion's personalities, and Bleeding Image knows everything Legion knows, which means Bleeding Image knows how the X-Men function. One of the things that he does is he says, okay, look, I can't defeat Rogue through conventional means. I mean, I can cause her physical pain, but I'm here to serve as a distraction. I'm here to allow Styx to make sure he can carry out his plan. And so what he does is he basically blows himself up. Now, this annihilates the Bleeding Image personality, right? Like, that personality is totally destroyed, gone forever. But the purpose was served. The purpose was to incapacitate Rogue. Now, on the surface, we would look at this and we would say, well, I mean, Rogue is virtually impervious to physical harm, right? Well, she is to a degree. I mean, an explosion that close of that magnitude would cause an issue for virtually anybody aside from like the Incredible Hulk or Juggernaut or Apocalypse or somebody like that. But because of the fact that Bleeding Image imprints his pain on others, the pain that Bleeding Image felt with the explosion is amplified in the mind of Rogue. And so it basically sends her nervous system into complete and total shock. Now, the other half of this is trying to find Charles Xavier. And that's the crazy thing, is because throughout all of this, Legion's been using the time sink power in order to keep time frozen in Paris. The issue is that the more Legion uses these powers, the more prominent the personalities become. And so it's basically time sink fighting back against Legion and trying to break itself free. So you guys kind of see how these personalities are very self-contained, how they operate in and of themselves, but also how they have their own desires and wants and ambitions to get away. Now, the whole idea of housing these personalities actually comes into play, really big time with X-Men Legacy Legion. For those of you guys who watch the Legion TV show, the concept of the insane asylum housing these personalities is basically a stand-in for the prison that Legion makes in his mind for all the personalities in the X-Men Legacy Legion comic. But what they end up doing is they basically come to this realization that the only way to really defeat Styx is to essentially allow Legion to relinquish his control over time, to basically walk away with his control over time, and in turn allow Styx to continue on with his own individual plan. Now, the reason why this matters is because of the fact that where Legion froze time, because of the fact that the personalities he has are part and parcel to Legion himself, those personalities weren't frozen. Those personalities were able to continue operating. The issue is everyone around those personalities was frozen. And so basically Styx couldn't really continue his plan. It gave them the ability to buy time, but in the end it didn't really matter because of the fact that when it came to the characters of the X-Men, they still had to find Styx himself, and Styx could still carry out his own campaign. Of course, we see this campaign coming to fruition when the X-Men descend down into the catacombs of Paris. Now, when they get there, all they're seeing are illusions. I mean, normally the catacombs just lead below a church, but they're basically seeing what amounts to hell. All these individuals whose souls have been taken and who are writhing and screaming in pain. It looks very much like the 9 circles of hell in Dante's divine poem, Inferno, I think is what it was called. It creates a really cool, interesting situation here. But what Styx has also done is he's basically dressed up skeletons to look like members of the X-Men. And so it's just playing mind games, right? I mean, it's playing mind games, it's playing shadow games. It's basically, screwing with their heads, leading them to believe that what they're seeing is real, but then blurring the lines between what's real and what's not real. Now, the other half of this is that because Styx knows the X-Men so well as a personality of Legion, Styx is also aware of the fact that the X-Men will not kill if they don't have to. And so what Styx basically does is say, look, I have Charles Xavier. That's how I'm casting all these illusions in the first place. What Styx does is take all these different individuals whose souls that he's absorbed and he sends them towards the X-Men. Now, that's the inherent power of Styx. Styx basically goes to individuals, touches them, absorbs their souls live on in him, and then he has total control of their physical bodies. So, in a lot of ways, Styx is very much this demon personality. The funny thing about this, though, is that Legion essentially walks away and ends up traveling to Styx. And the reason why is because Legion says, I'm the one you want. Like, you're chasing after me for a reason. What's the reason that you want me for? Leave the other X-Men alone. And when basically Legion hands himself over to Styx, Styx says, this has always been my goal. My goal has been to grab the Moira McTaggart personality from Age of X, the personality that has the ability to warp reality on a universal level. I want to have that personality, I want to have that power, and I want to recreate all of existence for myself. The funny thing is that once Styx grabs that personality, or at least grabs the body of Legion, what ends up happening is Styx grabs the personality of Endgame. Now, Endgame again is one of these own concepts in the realm of Legion that exists for self-preservation. The kicker here is that Endgame has what's called an adaptive metamorphosis, in the sense that Endgame can adapt to whatever it is that's attacking him. Now, we see that play out in a few different ways. Of course, you've got the super strength of Frenzy. She starts throwing objects at it. The durability of Endgame enhances in order to withstand the various objects that is throwing at her. But because of the fact that Endgame is basically just a giant robot, is how it manifests, Magneto turns and says, only a fool would send a robot against me. Well, in response, Endgame basically changes itself up to where it's not a metallic form anymore. That's how Endgame functions. It's able to adapt to virtually any situation. It's very much like Darwin from the X-Men Deadly Genesis storyline. So it's really cool in terms of how Endgame works. But then we find out the ruse that was created here by Legion himself. And what I mean here is that it seemed like Legion was giving up, right? Like he was basically just kind of like giving in to Styx and saying, okay, it poses a dangerous situation. If Legion gave over to Styx, that means that Styx would have access to all the powers that Legion possesses. And it's like, well, then there's thousands of powers that range anywhere from, baseline telepathy all the way up to reality on a universal scale. Well, then it would be the end of all things. Like it would be the end of everything. But we find out what had happened is that this Legion personality that Styx has been talking to is not the actual Legion. Instead, Legion was using the powers of Chain to duplicate himself. And that what had happened was that when this personality, when Legion himself basically entered, or at least it seemed like he entered the mind of Styx, this personality is actually Rogue, or at least this person is actually Rogue, that Legion imprinted himself on. He basically gave up his powers, or he let Rogue go back to who she was before. And then she turns around and starts absorbing the energy of Styx. Now, what this does is it begins to sort of lock them in this psychic knot, in the sense that you basically have Legion having to absorb both Rogue and Sticks at the same time in order to keep Sticks confined. And so what ends up happening here is that Charles Xavier actually has to delve into the mind of Legion in order to basically sort out this psychic knot that exists between Sticks and Rogue. And this is cool because we get a small glimpse of a lot of these personalities and how they exist in the mind of Legion. For example, they're all basically kind of shattered, they're in pieces, they're just scattered to the wind. It's like a 15-year-old kid's bedroom. Stuff's just everywhere. His mind is in total chaos. And that was always the struggle of Legion. That was always the issue with this character, was that there was no organization to his mind. There was no structure, there was no form, there was no basis. It was all just crazy. The personalities were just kind of running amok. They were all doing whatever it was that they wanted to do. That'll be the basis behind the whole X-Men Legacy Legion persona. It'll be basically him, where his personalities escape from their cells, so to speak, in his mind, and he has to start going around and rounding them up. Now, there is also a whole other story that kind of gets tied in as a second half, but what ends up happening, of course, is that Xavier is able to basically untie this psychic knot, and in response to that, all these personalities are confined back again within the mind of Legion. But what this does is it starts to kind of go out into the secondary plotline that was being written for this story with regards to the capture of like Rachel Gray, and some of these other characters by the Shi'ar. That's not really relevant to our discussion here at hand. Our little section just pretty much wraps up with the idea that Legion was able to regain his different personalities. But again, this is a pretty short little segment. Again, it's not super lengthy. It's not really long. I just thought it'd be kind of a fun little story where we did a bit of a tour about the different personalities of Legion, how they function, how they come together, that kind of thing. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, this is really kind of interesting. Again, X-Men Legacy Legion really focuses a lot on his character. We see a lot of other cool personalities like the Orgamist. The Orgamist is awesome. We get to see a lot of these really cool, interesting concepts. I can't remember the name of the guy, but he's like this weird giant green octopus thing that has the power of telepathy, like Omega level telepathy. It's crazy, the kind of things that Legion can do. But yeah, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.